did you hear about Ivo Perelman at first? What was your introduction to his music? And then how was the recording with him today?
How did I first hear about Ivo Perelman? And how was the music today? I heard about Ivo through Dominic Duval. Dominic really loved your music, and I spoke very highly of it. And then I heard a recording, solo tenor, Blue Monk. And I thought, yeah, Anthony Braxton for alto, Ivo Perelman, Blue Monk. Okay. Put me in the right direction. Yeah. And the recording today was interesting because we came to the recording with a blank canvas. Nothing was predetermined. It was just start and listen and try to find the music. The music will find us. We would find each other, and that's exactly what happened.
Beautiful. Okay. Okay, so John Coltrane, Albert Ayler, and Ornette Coleman have had enormous influence, even until today, in your music. Can you comment on the power of that inspiration?
Yes, specifically, I can comment on the power of the inspiration of John Coltrane, Ornette Coleman, and everybody, Monk, Charles Mingus, and all. On July 17th, 1967, the sun went out. John Coltrane, saxophonist supreme, was gone, and he wasn't coming back. And I think about someone saying this to James Baldwin. He's gone, Mr. Jimmy, and he ain't coming back. He took that giant step we all must take, Mr. Jimmy, and he ain't coming back. Well, on July 17th, I was in the Village on Barrow Street, preparing for a concert, not a concert, but a recording with Clifford Thornton. And a knock came on the door, and it was Ornette Coleman standing at the door. He heard me playing trumpet, because I only played trumpet at that time. And a knock came on the door, and he was standing there holding a trumpet, and he said, I heard you playing. He said, try this horn. He said, I've got a rehearsal hall just across the hall, just across from you, and when you're finished with it, just put it back in the room. I got to go to Fort Worth to see my family. And I couldn't believe it. I think Ornette Coleman handing me a trumpet. What? So I waited until I heard the door close, and I wiggled the valves a little bit, and I said, I can't do this. This is Ornette Coleman giving me the trumpet now. So I put it back in the room, and there was David Eisenson's bass, Charles Moffat's drums and his vibes, and Ornette's alto. And I thought, yeah, that's the end of it. And I drove home. And the funeral was on July 21st, I believe, a Friday. And I was back in that studio rehearsing for the recording session, which was going to be on the next day, the Saturday. And there was another knock on the door, and it was Ornette again. And he said, are you going to go to the funeral? And I said, I can't go. I don't have the right clothes. He said, you don't need clothes. You just go. So I went to the funeral. I was in the church. I saw Coltrane in his coffin. I heard Albert Ayler's quartet and Ornette Coleman's quartet playing in St. Peter's Church up in the balcony. The church has changed now. So that was a lot. So I went outside the church, and I was just standing there. And Ornette Coleman and Billy Higgins and another drummer named Harold Avent came out of the church. And Ornette said, we're going to the cemetery. Do you want to come? Why me? Yeah, of course I'm going to come. A Cadillac limousine pulled up, and I got in, and off we went to the cemetery. But we got stuck in traffic. And when we arrived, the service was over, and there was a tent over Coltrane's grave, and Ornette standing there. There are no photographs, Anything you read about or hear about that, you got from me because I told journalists about it. Nobody else was there. So after it was over, I went back down to Barrow Street because I was staying there overnight for the recording session the next day. And another knock came on the door, and it was Ornette, and he said, "You're playing with our trio at the Vanguard. Do you want to come?" So I went, and I heard Ornette play some Coltrane, and I heard him play more like Charlie Parker than I'd ever heard before. There were not many people in the room. And afterwards, we walked down 7th Avenue to a chicken joint, got some sandwiches, and went back to Barrow Street. And the next day, Saturday, was the recording session. So I arrived there with a bass player from upstate New York. His name was Tyrone Crabb. And he had a bass with no cover on it, just a raincoat. And we walk into the recording studio, and who would you suppose was the bass player, the other bass player? Jimmy Garrison. And they're like, "What is this?" You know, and he chastised Tyrone for not having the right cover on his bass. And we had the recording session, and yeah, that was amazing. That was my introduction to all of this insanity.
Do you think that the free jazz community of musicians constitute a stronger group of artists than the mainstream artists because of the struggles, because of the more innate spirituality pervasive in the community?
Do I think that the free jazz community is stronger than, let's say, the mainstream community in jazz? No, first I have to say this.
Yeah.
I don't understand free jazz. Jazz is by its very nature free. So it's a term that I try not to use. I think of what I do is I make music. And by that I mean I make magic with the muses. It's a gift that's freely given in the name of love. And I think our community of musicians, sure, are very closely knit. We come from, we're drawn from the same cloth. Another community here in America, continuing, with the African American community, and it's expanding to the Asian community, to the Latino community. We're all together in the same search for freedom and equality and our ability to listen and learn. It's part of the same cloth. It's the same material.
Cool. What similarities or no similarities that you find with Ivo Perelman's tenor saxophone, given the fact that he is a South American with a very different background than yours, although you just spent an hour playing improvised music with no preconceived materials, that was very involved, I am sure. So what explains that congeniality? What is deep inside both of you that can perpetuate this free flowing of musical ideas of both of you?
Let's see if I can distill that question down to this. What is it that Ivo Perelman has that excites every molecule in my body and makes us play music? We come from different backgrounds. We're on the same planet spinning around the same time. And I'm not avant-garde. I can't be ahead of my time or behind my time. I'm just in my time. And Ivo is here, and we're sharing the space and the time together. We listen to each other. We spiritually feel the music in a very similar way. It's not exactly the same. The sound that we get on our tenor saxophones comes very close because I think we have the same direction. We're moving in the same direction. And we're making discoveries along the way. I hear in your sound what I would like to have in my sound one day. I try to borrow from everybody. And Ivo, I borrow from you as well.
Now, could you please comment briefly on your experience throughout the years, or however brief or extensive was, playing with Peter Brotzman?
Peter. How would I explain my experience playing with Peter Brotzman? I first met Peter Brotzman in 1977 at a place called the Palais des Arts in Paris. Peter was playing with Han Bennett in a duo, and I was playing solo. And I saw Han Bennett playing the walls of the theater, and Peter Brotzman playing some of the most extreme sounds on the saxophone I'd ever heard before. And then after that, we went to an after party, and I saw the two of them drinking. I thought, oh my God, how are they going to survive this? Their music was very strong, and their lust for life was as strong. And eventually, I got to play with Peter. I was invited in let me see exactly when was it, 1997, to join Peter Brotzman's Chicago Tentet. It was originally an octet, but they decided to expand it. I was brought into the band, and Mats Gustafsson the same day. So that's how I actually met Mats Gustafsson. Peter's been an inspiration. It continues to be an inspiration. We're peers. I'm about a year or so older than Peter, so he can't mess with me. He's got something very strong going on. I really love him. He's a complicated man. He's an extraordinary artist, visual artist, and an amazing inspiration for me. You know, he's one of the top.
Great. Milo Fine.
Milo Fine, I met he and Steve Janitka in 1978 in Minneapolis. And we made a recording right immediately after we met, practically. And then in 1979, we went on a tour in Europe together. Milo's an extraordinary musician as well, very complex, sometimes not so easy. But I appreciate his music. And we went on a tour that ended up in kind of a disastrous situation. We ended up not speaking to each other, but that's what happens sometimes, you know. Sometimes you hit a good note, and sometimes you don't. But Milo I think he's still doing what he's been doing, very strong. And I saw him a few years ago in Minneapolis, and he's still kicking it.
Cool. Evan Parker.
Evan Parker. I met Evan Parker actually in the Hudson Valley where I live. He was, there's a record label, I think it's M&M, from London. And the owners of that company, his names escape me at the moment, invited Evan and me, and I met him, and we became friends. And eventually we made a tenor duo recording. I think probably about 1995 or thereabouts. And there's another one that's coming from 2002 where we played at the Art Institute of Chicago. I believe it was the Art Institute. So I'm looking forward to that. Evan is an amazing saxophonist who's developed a technique and a sound all his own. And he's been very generous with me, and I'm looking forward to this new release, not a new recording, but a new release coming soon.
There are two musicians that you and Ivo Perelman have worked, one more extensively than the others, but nevertheless, I'd like to hear what are the commonalities and how you felt playing with Dominique Duval, who you've worked extensively to group that made a mark on this kind of music, Trio X, to this day. So Dominique Duval and Matthew Shipp, both musicians, have played an important role in Ivo Perelman's career, and yours, I suppose.
Okay, what is the commonality between Ivo Perelman and Dominic Duval and Matthew Shipp? Dominic Duval, it turns out that Ivo Perelman, his experience with Dominic Duval and mine were virtually identical. Dominic one time got in touch with Ivo and said he wanted to play with him. He had a trio. He had a drummer there, who was Jay Rosen, and so Ivo and Dominic hooked up. I heard a recording of Ivo Perelman's solo Blue Monk variations, which I liked very much, and it turned out that Dominic one day called me on the phone and said, "I'm a bass player, and I want to be your bass player." And I said, "Well, that's great, but I don't have a band." So he said, "Well, there's a drummer sitting right here next to me, so now you got a band." And I said, "Well, that's great, but now I don't have a gig." So he said, "Okay." I said, "Dominic, listen, I'll call you if something comes up." Well, something did come up. It was a birthday celebration for John Coltrane at the Knitting Factory. And author and John Zved got in touch with me and invited me to play. So I called Dominic and Jay and another saxophone player, Joe Giardulo, and that was the opening salvo with Dominic. And for the third version of the Vision Festival, I was invited, and I brought Jay and Dominic, and it was called the Joe McPhee Trio, but I don't like that kind of thing. So after it was over, there was somebody blogging, and I didn't know what a blog was at that time. And this guy said, "Well, the band wasn't bad, but we'll probably never hear of them again." So we said, okay. We took the name X. It wasn't political. It was that we say X. When you see Trio X, you'll know who we were, and don't tell us we're not going to be heard from again. And that's how Trio X started. And we were together until Dominic passed away. I think it was in 2016 or so. And now we're about to embark on another version of Trio X, Trio XL, for a larger group with Rosie Hertline on violin, but the XL stands for legacy as well, with Dominic Duval Jr. on the bass.
So yeah, how was your experience playing with Matthew Shipp? Because you have played with him on a couple of times.
Only really one time. Matthew Shipp? Yeah, Dominic Duval and I were invited to. I don't remember if Jay was there or not. To Rahe, Finland. There was a festival there, way up in the north, and Matthew Shipp was on it. And so we were invited to join Matthew. That was the only time. I've known Matthew for a very long time. Actually, I think I first met him in 1994. He's a wonderful player, and we haven't had an opportunity to play so much together, but maybe at some point we will.
Has any of your early training from high school and military band, has the influences you were subjected in your early high school and later on during the military service influenced your current playing?
Did any of my experiences in high school or my military service influence my playing? Well, I have to say, in high school, the only thing that influenced me was I was in the high school band, and before that in an elementary school band, and before that the greatest influence on me was my father. When I was 8 years old, my dad was a trumpet player, and I was out playing stickball in the street one day, and he came and stood on the front porch and said, "Come here. Now it's time to learn some music." And I went in there with his trumpet and his music, and he played some for me. And I didn't want to do that because I prefer to play with my friends in the street. But then, there was an organization of young people from the various grade schools, and it was like the Music Man, and they presented all these instruments on stage, and I saw the trumpet. And I picked it up, and of course I could play it right away because my father had taught me. And the people said, "Oh, isn't that marvelous? He's a genius. He can play right away." That wasn't it at all. But in high school, I didn't play jazz. I listened, but I wasn't playing at all until one day, I think it was like in 1962, I went to this bar. I know they had jam sessions, and I saw some guys who were in the band playing, and I said, the next time I see them, I'm going to be playing jazz too. And the next time I did. But before that, the military service, I wrote on a piece of paper that I could play trumpet. There was some questionnaire about that. And they said, well, you qualify for electronics technology and all that. And I was interested in getting involved with computers when I got out of the Army. But there was no place in the electronics school. They said, well, we need trumpet players. And I said, no, I don't want to do that. I had enough of that. And they said, well, you may end up marching behind a tank. So I said, okay, I'll do it. So I was sent to after basic training, sent to an Army band training school, which was very intense. And there I learned theory and harmony and composition and all that. And I began to meet some very interesting musicians. And I took along all my LPs, John Coltrane, Eric Dolphy, Ornette Coleman, and I built a record player. And I connected it to an FM transmitter. And so I could block out all of the radio signals coming into the barracks and play John Coltrane and whatever. And that was a great experience. I met some wonderful people who were very helpful to me.
Okay. Next question is, what was it like lecturing at Vassar?
Well, what was it like lecturing at Vassar? I was introduced to Vassar by a friend of mine who was a poet and an actor and a dramatist by the name of Oliver Pitcher. And at that time, Vassar was interested in starting a course in what was called Black Studies. Now it's Africana Studies or whatever. In 1969. And at that time, I had a lot of hair and a beard, and I looked a lot like a character on a television show called Mod Squad, the character named Link. And I was interviewed by some young ladies, and the moment they took one look at me and my corduroy pants and a jean jacket and a black turtleneck shirt, and they said, this is the guy we want. Had nothing to do with the music. But then I taught, the class I had was called A Revolution in Sound, Music After Bebop, Ornette, Eric Dolphy, John Coltrane, etc., people like that. And it was an interesting experience until May, I think it was 1970, Kent State happened, and the killing of young people at Kent State. And that ended my course. Everything shut down. And eventually they started it again, but with different people. So it was interesting. At one point, Oliver was taking some of his students to see a play with Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee because they had a daughter who was a student at Vassar. And I was taking my students to hear a concert at Carnegie Hall with Freddie Hubbard. But on the way to New York, the bus broke down and we're stuck on the highway. And I'm the only one there in charge of these students. And of course, the police came and they didn't believe me. How could I was not much older than the students there. They said, get a bus over here. A Greyhound and Trailways, they were in conflict. But anyway, so we said, well, what should we do? Go back to Poughkeepsie, back to Vassar, or I think Mingus is at Slugs. So we diverted the bus and went to Slugs. We all went in there till 3 o'clock in the morning, got on the bus. And nobody was supposed to know this. We got back to Vassar about 5 o'clock in the morning. And I never told anybody what happened. But then one day, in 2008, I was playing at Roulette here in New York, and someone said to me, "There's a lady at the edge of the stage who wants to speak to you." And she said, "You don't remember me, but I was in that class that went to Slugs to hear Charles Mingus." She said, "It changed my life. I've been involved with music ever since." So that was a good thing.
Sure.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, couple more. What meaning does the term "as serious as your life," as in the book, have for you?
Well, I was fascinated by that book, and I was reading about
Which book?
I was fascinated by the book "As Serious as Your Life." I'm sorry, and I knew Valerie Wilmer. I read an article about Valerie Wilmer, and she was upset because people were using articles from her book and so on, and not giving her credit. So I thought, this music that I'm playing is as serious as my life. I don't take it for granted. So I wrote to her and I said I would really like to use that title, and she gave me permission to do that.
Why do you play so many different instruments? Is it just a curiosity, a drive for a more varied expression and general curiosity? Does it give you more options as far as gigs?
The question is, why do I play so many varied instruments? Does it give me more opportunities, more options? Well, first of all, as I said before, I was a trumpet player until 1968. Because when I came home from the Army, I had been reading about Albert Ayler. And in fact, while I was in the Army, I went to Copenhagen looking for him. And he had been at the Montmartre Jazz Club just before we arrived. And Booker Irvin was playing in the house band, I guess you might say, at that time. We asked him about Albert, and he said, "Oh, Albert and Don Cherry went to Paris." So we never met. And as soon as I got home, I went to a record shop and I found a recording, Bells. And I was standing in the record shop looking at it. And it's a unique recording because it has a recording on one side and a silk screen image on the other side. And I was just looking. I never saw anything like that. When a voice over my shoulder said, "What do you think of that music?" And I said, "I don't know. I can't wait to hear it." And he said, "That's my brother." It was Donald Ayler. And he said, "I'm a trumpet player." I said, "I'm a trumpet player too. I just got out of the Army." He said, "Well, listen, we're having a rehearsal at such and such a place." And he wrote down the address and gave it to me. And I thought, well, I don't have an instrument with me, and I live in Poughkeepsie, and I got to catch a train. So I never went. And I'm thinking, it's probably a good thing, because if I had gone to that rehearsal and heard Albert Ayler up close, I'd never played a saxophone. So anyway, when I got home and I played that music, I thought, oh my God. A friend of mine had a tenor in a closet. He wasn't using it, so I asked if I could borrow it. I knew nothing about playing it. And so for 2 days, I just kind of did things. I didn't know how it actually worked. And then I went to a jam session. And I played a few notes or something, and the people there told me, said, "Don't come back with that thing." And I said, okay. So I would go to the jam sessions, and I would wear a black bow tie, a white shirt, and workman's coveralls, and big sunglasses, and I'd sit there like this at every Sunday jam session, but I didn't take my instrument. And I practiced. I actually have never had a lesson on the saxophone. I taught myself to play, and I bought a book on how it works. So 6 months after that, I had my first concert, played my tenor, and I invited the people who told me not to bring the saxophone. 1 year after that, I made my first recording called Underground Railroad, and I played my tenor and been playing it ever since.
Albert Ayler was one of the last technical innovators and concept innovators of the tenor saxophone. Has anything of equal or more importance as far as that happened ever since? to the tenor
well,
saxophone?
Albert Ayler was a giant and innovator of the tenor saxophone. Has anything happened after that?
Is there still room for growth for saxophone technique and
Is there still room for growth in
has everything been explored technically on the
anything
saxophone?
been explored technically? Is there room for growth in the exploration of the tenor saxophone? I think absolutely. There's nothing to hold it back. There's no end of it. It's opening in many different ways. And that's one reason why you asked earlier about why do I play so many instruments? Because they're there. There's an opportunity to do it. And why not? What's to stop me? I don't know what my limits are. And I push the limits. And I get tired of my own cliches. I'm trying to find new things. This terrible pandemic that we've gone through killed every opportunity possible to play, and I'm fed up with that goddamn Zoom shit. I don't want to do that anymore. It was necessary for a moment, but I hated it. Playing with people live is what, inspires me. So I'm now trying to learn how to play the clarinet, which is going to be difficult and trying, and I may never be good at it, but I may never be good at anything, but I'm going to, it's like being in orbit. When we see these satellites in orbit, it's not that they're suspended above the Earth. They're actually falling towards the Earth, but the Earth is always moving away. They just never get there. And I think that's what I'm about. I may never get there, but I'm still going to be trying.
Beautiful. Last question. Much of your work is connected to a long list of esteemed European collaborators. Could you speak on regional differences among improvised music communities and audiences in Europe versus the United States?
Can I speak about the differences between... I collaborate with a lot of different musicians, especially in Europe. And is there a difference between the European communities and in the United States? For me, no. We're in a community of musicians. We speak a universal language. There may be some technical differences of what we're doing, but we're doing an improvised music. And that means we're doing it on the fly, finding things along the way, finding people along the way, finding different means of expression, different ways of getting to the same goal, falling towards Earth at the same rate. In Europe, there was for a long time a big difference because the music that we call jazz was unique to Europeans. Here, who cared about it here in America? But we could go to Europe and people would be interested. They would be exposed to it more. You don't see much jazz on television, occasionally in some movies at some kind of background stuff. But with this improvised music, I don't know if it's jazz or not. I don't know if what I play is jazz. If that suits you to call it jazz, fine with me. I don't care. I play music. Period.